Hello, everyone. My name is Karen England, and I'm the president of the San Diego Horticultural Society. And I am wanting to welcome you tonight to our YouTube recording of our recent general meeting that we had on Zoom. The recording had some difficulties, so this is filling in and fixing those hiccups that we encountered. And I'm confident that you will enjoy tonight's presentation. And we will, I'd like to introduce to you the speaker you are about to hear, John Clements of the San Diego Botanic Garden in Encinitas, California, give a presentation on, well, he called it a brief history of citrus in Southern California. And because of the hiccups, it was a little more brief than he had intended, but it's still a fascinating talk. John has been a horticultural professional for 45 years, a former nursery owner, gardener, and koi pond builder to the rich and famous, a horticulturist, commercial fruit tree farmer, garden writer, agricultural historian, co-administrator with Nan Sturman of the San Diego Gardener Facebook group, and horticulture manager of the 37-acre San Diego Botanic Garden. His experience and knowledge comes through even with the setbacks he encounters in his PowerPoint this evening. I will join you again at the end to give you a little bit more information before we close the evening. But now I would like for you to sit back and enjoy John Clements and a brief history of citrus in Southern California.
So, as I said, this is going to be a really, really brief history of citrus. And so we're going to just see where it takes us. But we'll start. Really, you know, the Native Americans that were here were true hunters and gatherers. You know, there are many Native American tribes that were farmers. But our own local folks were not. They really migrated perpetually, and they would go from mountains to deserts to the seashore on regular passages. And so they were true hunter-gatherers. And that doesn't diminish their culture in any way. It's, you know, sometimes I think if I could do that, I love to hunt and I love to gather, and I also love to fish. And I would think that would be a pretty magnificent existence, actually. Being tied to a spot where you have crops fail and so on, can be a lot more challenging than just roaming around and giving what Mother Nature has in store for us. So, but really, agriculture starts with the Europeans, at least in Southern California. And if Jim Bishop's on, I know he would recognize this spot. And those two palms, this slide dates from about 1860.
Not that old.
Not that old. And those plants, those palms.
Jim was there.
Yeah, Jim may have been there. No, Jim looks so young. He couldn't have been there. I wish I was as young looking as Jim, or his aunt. The aunt, I think, is a stunner still at 90 years old. So this is Kosoi. And some of you may recognize just the geographical aspects of that hill. That's Presidio Hill. And when the Europeans arrived, this was actually an Indian village, and it was called Kosoi. And the friars planted 4 palm trees on that site. So that was the original spot they wanted to build the mission and the Presidio and all that. And it was the Presidio for a while. But the plants that they planted, if you recognize what those are Phoenix dactylifera. Those are desert date palms. And of course, they will grow very nicely here. Phoenix dactylifera grow great on the coast, but they won't fruit. And so those stood, the last of them was in that spot until like 1956. So these were, almost 200-year-old palm trees by the time the one went out. And but what they found was that spot was not very good for raising crops. The river, of course, had a very high water table, but they were having a hard time getting enough water for the crops. And so they found that they were too far away from the water. They moved the crops the next year closer to the river, and then they all got flooded away. And so after about 4 years in that spot, they moved east to what is now the San Diego Mission de Alcala. And you notice they also brought more palm trees with them. They liked the Phoenix dactylifera. Again, they wouldn't give any fruit because it's not really warm enough in our zone for those to bear dates. But in that slide there, that's Mission Valley, and that's a condo complex right now, right where those palm trees are. And that's San Diego Mission Road is what that dirt road is there. And there were no oranges there, and there were no lemons there. This was really an olive grove. And you'll find that the Spanish, when they came, they wanted plants that would travel well. And so citrus don't travel that well. Seeds will, but the plants themselves, not so much, because they need too much water. And they did bring pomegranates in the writings of the fathers at the mission. They also had plenty of olives, and they had lots of figs, but no citrus in the San Diego Mission. And we moved to the next mission. That's Mission San Luis Rey. And again, there they had wheat, they had figs, they had pomegranates, they had lots of olives, no citrus. Moved to San Juan Capistrano, the third mission in the chain. And at San Juan Capistrano, there's never a mention of citrus in the writings of the Padres. And now bear in mind, the mission system died by 1833. There were no missions that were really the way they were started anyway, is sort of colonizing outposts. They only had about a 50-year lifespan, 1769 to really 1821 or so. They began to have problems. And then by 1833, the missions are done. And so there was never citrus there. We get to the fourth mission. That's Mission San Gabriel, Arcangel. And that's in the San Gabriel Valley. And that's the first mission that had citrus. And it was 1771, as I recall. And that one, they did have citrus. They brought seeds and they sprouted oranges and lemons. They also had lots of olives. But the most important thing about Mission San Gabriel was the vines. It was a huge wine producing area. And so many of the original vines in California came from Mission San Gabriel, and they were actually called Mission Wine or Mission Vines, and they were spread throughout California. And so next shot, this is actually a work of art that dates from 1854, and you can see right in the middle of the photograph, kind of to the left margin and about a third of the way up, there's citrus trees there. So that Mission San Gabriel was the first place that we actually have a recording of citrus in California. And they did very, very well. One thing about the San Gabriel Valley is it's all alluvial soil. The San Gabriel River runs through it, and the Santa Ana River runs tangentially, has a very high water table, has very good soil, and things did really well there. In fact, I don't know if you know this, I hang out with my colleagues at the Huntington whenever I can. I love it up there. They have well water. The entire Huntington Botanic Garden is watered by wells. And can you imagine if we could do that in San Diego? And it's actually very, very good water too. It's not the salty dreck that we get. So it's a pretty amazing spot to grow plants. So one of the reasons that you don't have a recording of citrus too much in the earlier writings and the earlier colonies with the emissions and the early Californios is this is a great illustration to show why that was the case. Citrus were not important to them. Cattle were, and cattle was really the basis of their entire economy. And they really weren't even used for the beef, which is a travesty. I mean, how many of you would like a great ribeye steak and prime rib and all that? They didn't really even slaughter the beef for the meat. It was for the hides. And they were just like money. And so a lot of the meat even went to waste. There's no refrigeration. There's difficult ways to try and cure that much meat. And so it was really, even as meat product, it was wasted. But citrus trees never really entered their consciousness. That was a very unimportant thing. This is a guy that's responsible for citrus being in California, and really to a large degree. This is William Wolfskill, and he is a very interesting character. His parents went to Kentucky at the invitation of Daniel Boone, and so these were very, very adventurous, very stout, hardy people, you know, being on the frontier, actually out there with Daniel Boone. So this guy was born in Kentucky, spent some time in Missouri, and he's really earthy stock. He's a very smart man. He's uneducated. He did know how to read and write, but he was a brilliant, brilliant man. And he was a voracious reader, and he had a photographic memory. And so he was quite an interesting cat. And so his family was in Kentucky. And then he got, I suppose the wanderlust and the travel bug, and he wanted to move west. He needed some more adventures. So after spending some time in Missouri, he then goes to New Mexico. And in New Mexico, he spends 10 years, and he spends 10 years in a very interesting profession. He is a mountain man. And he's a fur trapper. And so while he's in Taos, New Mexico, and in Santa Fe, he meets a very interesting tableau of characters. So his best friend is George Yount, who we'll talk about in a minute. Kit Carson is one of his associates. Pegleg Smith, John C. Fremont, these guys were all scouts and mountain men and fur traders and trappers. So they were a very interesting, kind of a motley crew, but a very interesting group. And so he decided to just hang out in New Mexico. And while he's in New Mexico in 1821, he becomes a Mexican citizen. So it's very interesting. The Mexicans were very open to having people become Mexican citizens because they needed to fill this vast empty space of the West. And so if you would come to their territory, they didn't have a wall, they didn't kick you out. And if you wanted to become a Mexican, you just say, "Hi, I'd like to be a Mexican." And you change your first name to a Mexican name. So he became Guillermo Wolfskill. You have to promise you're going to be a Catholic. And it's really a good idea if you can marry a nice Mexican girl. So he does all of the above. And he decides that after he's now a Mexican citizen, his friend George Yount also became a Mexican citizen. They decide to leave after 10 years of saving money in New Mexico as fur trappers. They move west. And this was actually called the William Wolfskill Party. And in 1831, they followed a Pegleg Smith map. And these guys go through the desert, through the Mojave Desert. He almost is killed by a guy in New Mexico. He shoots him. The bullet goes through some of the furs, through his arm, and then through his hand. and the guy thought he was dead. And so he manages to find his way back to civilization. And the guy reports that William Wolfskill was killed in an Indian attack. And then when he's meeting the authorities, he's very surprised to see William Wolfskill there. And so he's a character. This guy is very resilient, very stout, and he's got a very colorful life. And so in 1831, they decide to head west, and they land in Los Angeles. And this is George Yount. George Yount was also a mountain man, one of his best buddies. And when he hit Los Angeles, he said that he thought that was just a little too crowded for him. Anybody else share that? You know, it's like LA's too crowded, too much traffic. Well, there were about 250, maybe 300 people in LA in 1831, and he headed north. And he went to a place called Rancho Camus, which is up in Napa Valley. And so he becomes the largest landowner in the Napa Valley, Sonoma area. He founds a little town up there, actually still exists, called Yountville. Yeah. And he becomes the biggest wine producer in that part of the country. And if it hadn't been for George Yount, we probably wouldn't have the big wine industry that's up in Sonoma and in Napa Valley. His family eventually, his offspring marry into the Rutherford family, and the Rutherford vineyards still exist up there. And they have not left the families all the way back to George Yount. And he ended up with, as I recall, 12,000 acres up there, which is pretty crazy. It's a lot of land and a lot of wine. So the Californios show very little interest in agriculture. And so when William Wolfskill arrives in LA, he thinks, why don't they have large-scale operations of fruit trees and farms and vineyards? And like I said, they really were just much more into cattle. And the whole economic basis was cattle and actually having a really good time. They didn't want to be tied down to a lot of care of crops and trees. They really enjoyed this freewheeling kind of a cowboy lifestyle. But William Wolfskill was a terrific, fabulous horticulturalist. And so when he hit LA, you know, at that time, that whole area that's down by Olvera Street now, and it used to be a state park, it's actually now a county park, but Olvera Street was really the entire town of Los Angeles. And the plaza that was there, the homes and the adobes and the farms all radiated out around from that. And so Wolfskill decided he was going to become a farmer, and he had 48 acres right in the middle of what is now downtown Los Angeles. And in this picture, this is William Wolfskill, and those are some crazy bananas. He raised all kinds of stuff, and he would have people show up on a boat, and if they had anything that he could plant, he planted it. And so all the way back in the 1830s and 40s, he has bananas, and he has guavas, and they have sapote. And so, you know, a lot of my rare fruit friends think that they invented all these kind of, they're so novel to have these fruits. Well, William Wolfskill beat him to it a long, long, long time ago. And he had apricots and apples and plums and peaches. And the big thing he had was wine grapes. And so he began to expand the wine industry too. So he becomes the biggest vintner in all of California, this guy from Kentucky. And so he's not just about citrus, he's into really anything that'll grow, he grows. And he's also into getting as much land as he can get his hands on. This is an 1859 engraving. That's his farm. And that's, believe it or not, that is downtown Los Angeles. And in the foreground of the picture, right where that train is, that's just about where the train depot is now in Los Angeles. And you can actually tell, even by the engraving, some interesting crops there. You can actually discern by some of the shapes. There's bananas down the middle. He had apples on the upper section of the farm, the oranges. he had actually had pineapples too, and pineapples did pretty well there. He had quite an extensive, really, the 48 acres of an amazing array of different fruits. This is an 1858 photograph, and this is downtown Los Angeles, believe it or not. And the Los Angeles River, there's a tree. I don't know if you can see my arrow, if I'm moving the arrow and showing it on my screen. This tree is what that entire area was named after. There's a street called Aliso Street, and in Spanish, aliso is a sycamore tree, and this sycamore tree was huge. You could see it over the entire Los Angeles basin, and this was a meeting place for the Tongva Indians, and so this tree was really considered sacred, and it was around for a long time. And I didn't mean to go forward yet. So this whole area, he had his farm down in this zone all the way out kind of west and south. And then this area that's near that tree, didn't mean to jump forward, sorry. There we go. Where that tree is became, again, one of the biggest vineyards in the state. A Frenchman, see, the Mexicans were not interested in wine, but Wolfskill is interested in wine. Yount is interested in wine. And another guy named Jean-Louis Vignier from France put vineyards there, and he had very, very good wine. And actually have an old bottle that dates from 1850 something of Jean-Louis Vignier wine, and no wine left in it, but it was really quite an operation. And then that tree stood until, gosh, 1890s or so, and it became the site of I think it was the 84 brewery or something. Anyway, the worst beer ever made known to mankind was there, and unfortunately the tree would have been better to save and forget the brewery. But this is interesting too. In the foreground, this little structure that it's all brick, that was a reservoir. And throughout this whole area, this is the Los Angeles River running through here. They had a thing called the Madre Zanja, and it just means the mother ditch. And they would actually carry water from the Los Angeles River down into the town. And William Wolfskill had all of his crops irrigated pretty neatly. And so it was quite an operation. This is Irvine Ranch. So this became a holding of Mr. Wolfskill. And Wolfskill, he was pretty smart. He got all these orange trees going. Then he began to breed them, and most of them were Spanish origin. And depending on who you want to believe, William Wolfskill, according to most people, the state anyway, thinks that William Wolfskill is the one who's credited with creating the Valencia orange. There's some historians in Anaheim and other places that think it was some other people, but I think the case is probably pretty clear. He was the first guy that was doing a lot of breeding with oranges, and he had the biggest orchards. And he began to plant the orchards down to what is now Irvine Ranch. So that whole area near El Toro and Irvine and that strip that's down there, he put in orange groves. And so he kind of made Orange County into Orange County before anything else was there. And thing happens in 1849 that changes California, and that's the gold rush. And in his wisdom, he planted all these orange trees. Well, he didn't have a big market for the orange trees because there were very few people in Los Angeles. And so there were also very few railroads. He didn't have a way to ship it. But when the gold rush hit, suddenly miners were getting scurvy, and he was shipping his oranges up north in just wagons and carts and shipping them on ships. And his oranges, and adjusted for inflation, I don't know what this would be, but he was selling his oranges back in 1849 for $1 a piece. So that was a pretty crazy investment. And he made a ton of money, and he bought up land wherever he could. And so he ran sheep on Irvine Ranch, and he planted more oranges. And then he sold that land to James Irvine and a couple of other cowboys back in 1864. And the oranges were there in the right foreground. That's actually Irvine Ranch, the barn and one of the original homes. And you can see even back then, it's become a pretty fantastic orange growing area. One thing about oranges, doesn't really do anything to the first side, and really from San Gabriel down along the foothills and Mount Baldy, and then down into Riverside and down as far as north of Temecula. And that was really the citrus belt for the navel, whereas Valencia's hugged the coast. And there's good reasons for that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So time-wise, in terms of the development of California and the development of citrus, in 1869, there is a huge event. I mean, this is an earth-shaking event, both for the history of the United States, history of California, but also for the history of oranges. And this is Promontory, Utah in 1869. And this is a classic historical photograph. This is East meets West. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific meet, and they drive the Golden Spike. Well, before the railroads came through, there wasn't a market because California was just not that populated. And so if you have a whole lot of fruit to sell, there's no place to sell it. And so once they finally get railroads in, there are plenty of Easterners who would love to have oranges in winter. And so once the railroad goes through, it changes California, changes the citrus industry, but it also changes the way people viewed California. And at another time, we'll actually go through a bunch of photographs, great old postcards. Almost every one of them was produced by the railroads, by the Harvey House people, or by the Santa Fe Railroad, or the Union Pacific, because oranges actually become a tourism ploy. And so people aren't just having oranges shipped back to the East Coast and eaten here. They actually began to bring people in, because if you were in snowbound Chicago in the wintertime, they'd say, well, take a train, it'll take you 3 days, and you can go visit California. And you'll see postcards that say, you can throw your snowballs back east and I'll eat the oranges out here in California. I mean, there must have been a million postcards that have that phrase on it. And so it becomes a tourism ploy. It becomes really a farming and marketing ploy to send all those oranges back to the East Coast. And the railroads figure really prominently in that whole equation. Oh. Let's see. How did I get out of that? Let's see. Irvine. Oh, no. Did my other slides not transfer? Oh, hang on. Oh, crud. Oh, son of a gun. Oh, I've had so many technological glitches.
Try the down button.
Yeah, I am. I said we had to actually transfer my program to my brother's computer, and then in order to make it happen, because I couldn't make the camera work on mine, so I think my slideshow stopped at that slide. It shouldn't have, but the others didn't transfer. Oh, crud. Oh, this is a challenge. Well.
But they were there.
John.
Yeah, they were there. It was on the original PowerPoint in my other computer.
Well, can your other computer join the meeting, and then he can make you presenter? We won't see you, but we'll hear you. And
Let me see.
How about hitting play from current slide?
Actually, we'll see you because you'll be on both of them.
Right. Play from current. Yeah, it just looks like it stopped right with that slide, and I don't know why it didn't transfer. Folks,
There's something awfully ironic about the two railroads meeting and the two computer slides said snot.
yeah, yeah, yes. Is that Deborah Young? It sounded like Deborah. Hello, Deborah. Let me see here. Well, and I'm the biggest Luddite in the entire universe, so my brother has the complete opposite gifting. So he is a computer whiz, as is my dad, but not I. Oh, crud. Oh, I am not seeing how to get this.
I apologize. There's a button that says play from current slide.
Play from current
You have
slide.
the second from the left.
You got to have a slide.
Top. Yeah. Wait.
Yeah, I think
Not
the
that one.
slides.
No. Oh.
Yeah, the slides didn't transfer for some reason.
No. Okay.
I think it stops at that slide, and there should be more slides. Yeah, it's like the PowerPoint didn't save it or something.
Play from current slide. Up from play from start. Yeah.
Okay, let's try that.
He's-
No,
It says it's the end of the slide presentation. So
see, yeah, that's not, but it is. Unfortunately, crap. Well, pardon my French. Well, I'll tell you what.
Is your other computer nearby?
No, unfortunately. Dang it. Well, my humblest apologies. This has been a real challenge.
John,
Yeah,
stop,
hi, Deb. Hi, Bernie.
stop apologizing. You're wonderful at word pictures. Just keep talking.
Oh, well, so at another time, we can talk about the biggest event that happened, and that is 1870. So we're looking, with 1869, the railroads come through. 1870 transforms the citrus industry forever, and that was with the advent of an orange that had been discovered in Goa, of all places. And in Goa, they found this orange that they called a navel because the end of it was like somebody's navel. And so it was terrific because it was easy to peel, and it had no seeds, and it was quite sweet, and it was good. Well, that orange made it to Portugal. And from Portugal, it went to Brazil, and it went to a place called Bahia. And if you haven't read, this is sort of like a podcast now, isn't it? So it's a podcast instead of a slideshow. If you haven't read the book yet, I so heartily endorse the book by David Stone called Food Explorer. I couldn't put it down. I just kept reading until I was done. It was such a fascinating book. And it really talks about the advent of so many of the fruits and foods that we take for granted in America that were brought by these really intrepid, stout and hardy souls that would go out and collect these things. And so that particular orange was brought to Brazil, to Bahia, and then that orange ended up making its way to the United States through these wonderful food explorers, the USD and other ways. And so a woman in Riverside, California, and if anybody's interested, we can have another slideshow. We'll actually start there and move forward. But she was a very interesting lady. Her name was Eliza Tibbetts, and she's married to Luther, and they're East Coast people. And they left the East Coast because they wanted to go to California, and they were very, very interesting people. I don't know if you know this, but so many of the people that were responsible for fruit in California were very religious, and I'm a religious person, so I'm not casting aspersions at any of these people. But they were very pious, very Christian in the sense, big C Sunday school type people, like David C. Cook up in Peru, and Charles Chapman, who actually helped found Chapman University. There were a couple of Quaker guys that were in Riverside, in Redlands, made a lot of money in New York, and they were Quakers. They come out to California because they don't like the winters. So in Hollywood, I don't know if you know this, Hollywood was actually a dry community. It was founded by very, very devout Methodists that were teetotalers. And imagine Hollywood being, a religious commune of the most conservative and pious sort. But anyway, this is really the way California was. And so here comes Eliza Tibbets, and Eliza is a suffragette. She is a spiritualist, so they believe in necromancy and have seances and things, which a lot of people did back then. But she and Luther aren't even legally married. They're common law together, so they're living together, which was quite scandalous in a pretty religious California in 1870. And so she was in fact, they went and founded a community, believe it or not, they called themselves free thinkers. And so I'm sure a lot of us would have really liked these people. And so they tried to do some farming and it didn't work out so well. And then Eliza had a friend who worked at USDA in Washington, D.C. And she said, I remember you talked about there were some trees that you found in Brazil and that maybe they would be good candidates for, a place that's hot in the summer and cold in the winter. We live in such a place. They lived in Riverside on Magnolia Avenue. And they said to her friend, well, could you send us a couple of cuttings from those trees? Well, there were 4. He sent 2. And she planted them and they took. And they did really, really well. And in those times, people would get together and they would have fruit expositions. And at these fruit expositions, they would display their fruit and they would all taste each other's fruit and discover which were the best varieties and try to promote commercialization of their crops and things like that. So when she brought these oranges, they made a huge hit. Everybody said, oh my God, we've never tasted oranges as good as these oranges. And Eliza, we need to get these propagated and make sure we're selling them off. So they said, there was a guy who had a little nursery and he says, I'll tell you what, I'll handle all the selling of your budwood. Well, people started stealing the budwood from their trees. And so you see pictures, and I had lovely slides of their house. Originally, they put a fence around the trees and they got dogs because people kept breaking in and stealing their budwood. And then later they have the trees wrapped in barbed wire, literally wrapped in barbed wire, because people would come and try to steal their budwood. Well, these 2 trees, and there were only 2 trees of this Washington, they called it Washington navel because of course it came from Washington, DC. And that's why they're called Washington navels. But what they discovered, if you're in Riverside, they love how hot Riverside is. I don't. I really don't. But the orange trees loved it. Also, you'll discover that in that whole zone, that inland empire, in those foothills beneath the snow-capped mountains, those became iconic. And we'll have pictures another time of these snow-capped mountains with orange trees and palm trees beneath them. And they make such a great postcard, and the train going through and the trees covered with oranges. And so it transformed the orange industry. And suddenly people went nuts for the navel orange, and they're shipping them to the East Coast. And people decided they wanted to move to California. And that really changed California, because suddenly it got crowded. And if you thought that you were going to just become an orange farmer and you could get a few trees and you would set about raising citrus, you're wrong. It was really a plaything of the wildly and fabulously rich. What you discover is anybody who was anybody in the orange business, you see all these, vast acreages of oranges. One of the things, there's a common thread. A lot of these people were publishers, and a lot of them were from Chicago or Cleveland. And it was cold back there. They didn't like the weather. And so they came out here. You buy 100 acres or 1,000 acres, and you start an orange orchard. And you live in the sunshine, and you have citrus blossoms, and life is good. And so it changes California forever. And so really, you go from about 1830 with William Wolfskill, and it takes you, really the orange industry was done about 1955. And it's iconic and ironic that one of the death knells of the citrus industry was Disneyland. You look at these pictures and you realize that suddenly where all these orange trees were, they carve it away, and suddenly there's an amusement park. Well, then suddenly around the amusement park is a subdivision and a strip mall, and life's never the same. So just that tail end of the citrus industry is kind of my youthful days, and it totally changed California. And one of the things that's interesting about why the citrus trees were bifurcated by a really mountain range, the Santa Ana Mountains. If you go east, you have always the navels, and if you go west, you have Valencias. And that's because the navels really need the heat and they like the cold. And one of the things you'll find about navel oranges is that they will, and you can actually buy a tree. There's some people that you can have, it's like a CSA with oranges. But as soon as the freezing temperatures hit, then the tree stops growing and it doesn't send new growth out. And so old time orange growers will tell you that if you get oranges, navel oranges, from these very cold winter nighttime temperature areas, that the oranges are much, much sweeter. And you'll find that suddenly the peel will turn a deep, almost red orange when the frost hits, and they become sweeter and juicier because all of the energy goes exclusively into making sweet, sugary, wonderful juice instead of energy onto the tree. And so that's one of the reasons that zone is so different than the Valencia zone. And so if you want to raise great navels, move to where it's hot in the summer, cold in the winter. If you want great Valencias, raise them right here on the coast where we're at, Encinitas and Claremont and Mission Hills and Pacific Beach. And you'll also find lemons don't like to be in that zone where the navels are because it's too cold. They're very frost tender. And in fact, San Diego was never an orange growing area. There are a few pockets, very, very small amounts of oranges, but San Diego was essentially lemons. And the one thing that probably wiped out lemons in San Diego more than any other thing was the Great Freeze of 1913. And it literally wiped out the lemon industry in San Diego. And Chula Vista was almost all lemons. And in 1913, it wiped them out. The Horton Plaza fountain froze solid. It was a crazy winter. So just a brief touching of the mountaintops of history of citrus. And if you're a follower of San Diego Gardener, I'll be posting some photos. We can continue this thought about the growth of the citrus industry and its implications and all of that. But anyway, that's about my time, I think, too. Anybody have any questions about citrus in general, or things to grow?
John?
Yes.
The citrus came from Portugal, but my understanding is they originally came from China. How did they get?
Yes.
When did they move to the European area?
Well, mostly through the Portuguese. They would travel through Asia, and then they went into the Indian subcontinent. And the particular, it was called the Selecta, was that one that became the Bahia, and then eventually became Washington Navel. It went from someplace, they're not sure exactly where in China or South Asia, but it went from there to Goa, and then from Goa, because the Portuguese, to Portugal, and then Portugal to Brazil, and then Brazil to the United States. So the story of colonization.
John, we have some questions about blood oranges around here and grapefruits. So could you talk a little bit about those?
Sure. Well, you'll find that there were actually some pockets of blood oranges raised commercially in Orange County at one time. You'll see some photographs up near Orange, the city Orange, and in Lemon Heights. There's some pockets where they used to have a few blood oranges, little groves. But blood oranges tend to like more extreme temperatures. And so again, they would be best in a zone that you would grow navels in. So coastal, they don't get the color quite so much. They don't get as much intense flavor. That kind of, I liken blood oranges to sort of raspberry or strawberry infused flavor wise. And there's these undertones. That's what makes them interesting, frankly, is that they have these undercurrents of interesting flavors. But on the coast, they don't color up as much. They don't get as sweet, and they don't get as much of that intensity of those kind of underlying flavors. And then there are also some that are every other year producers. And so, they're great if you've got room. I love blood oranges. There's nothing quite like them. But you have to have room. They're not as small of a tree as a lot. And then also because of tending toward every other year production. And if you pick the fruit more readily, then the more you let it hang on the tree, or if you let it overproduce, you won't get as much subsequent years. So they're a little tricky. Was there a specific question on the blood oranges?
It was more about habitat. I'm reading in the chat, but from my, it was kind of, I'm wondering, is there a variety of blood orange that would be better around here than another?
Yeah, I think Moro is better on the coast. Tarraco is better if you're more inland, and I think it does better with a little more heat. So if I had my choice for one, I'd take a Moro. And those are usually you'll sometimes find Sanguinelli. Sanguinelli is also one that I think needs a little more heat. But if you can get a Moro, it'll tend to do better. I had a Moro, and it did quite well. And but it did tend toward, I'd have some years I'd have 500, and then I'd have some years where I'd have 10. And so it does tend to, alternate year bearing. But my goodness, they're so nice. They never really, in California, were that big of a success commercially, because people were sort of off-put by, the dark, it's too bloody looking. Well, that's what I actually like, put that in some nice sangria or something. I like it, but yeah.
I have a question. If the first oranges didn't have seeds, where did these blood oranges even come from? Or how did we propagate so many by just grafting everybody?
So the Washington navel orange, those were all grafted. So those were all taken from budwood and then grafted. But one of the things you'll discover about especially oranges, more so than other citrus, they tend to mutate. They frequently have mutations. And so the the Bahia orange, what we call the navel, that's just a mutation from another type of orange. And then if you've ever heard of a cara, a pink navel, which is a great fruit, by the way. It's very sweet, very nice size. But that is actually a mutation of a straight Washington navel. And it was found on the cara plantation in Venezuela. And what you'll find is that on an orange tree, you go out there and suddenly one of the branches looks different. And the fruits could have more seeds or no seeds. or the color might be different. It might be sweeter. It might be more sour. And oranges are really notorious for that. And so they mutate. And so when they find a good mutation, then they propagate the good mutation. And then we have millions and millions of all identical trees. So all those Washington navels were genetically identical.
Wow. A little bit about some grapefruit before I move on to Meyer lemon challenges with leaf curl. So
interesting. Well, you know, golly, Meyer lemon is one of the more, I think, one of the easier ones to grow. So if you're having challenges with the curl, I'd say don't fret too much, because, you know, it's just ubiquitous and it's hard to do much about it, to be honest with you. But what you do want to do is make sure that the tree is as vigorously growing as you can get it. You want it to grow vigorously, make sure it's well fed. So here's the challenge, I think, most of the time for people with lemons, is that lemons in our climate don't stop. They don't stop growing, and they also don't stop producing. And so I'll ask people, well, Jolly, when was the last time you fed that tree? Oh, I don't know, last year. Or I put, you know, a box of citrus food earlier this spring. Well, that doesn't cut it. You know, especially if it's a big lemon tree. I find that you have to fertilize at least 4 times a year. And with lemons especially, they take a ton of food because they're making a ton of fruit. And so if you're not feeding them, then you're really going to not get the production. You're not going to get the growth that you need. And so if your tree is not actively growing, then you'll find that it's not able to fight back and be as resilient as it could be, and it succumbs more to the leaf mire. So I'd say, you know, when was the last time you fed it? I'd be feeding it. In fact, here's my advice: citrus all around, especially if you haven't fed them in a while. You'll find with citrus that about 60 to 70% of your growth on that citrus tree for the entire year is going to happen in mid-January. People don't realize that. And so if you have not fertilized it in a long time, and suddenly in mid-January it wakes up, because what happens with citrus, lemons less so because they bloom and they grow all the time. But let's say your oranges, your grapefruits, your tangerines, you know, some of the multi-generic crosses. So mid-January, they throw out a bunch of flowers. And then right after they throw out those flowers, they throw out all their growth. So if you haven't fed it for a while, it's going, you know, I don't have any energy to build my body with. And so what'll happen, people will see, they'll call me up, they'll say, gee, my tree is completely covered with blossoms, or my tree is covered with all this new growth, and I want to feed it now. Well, now it's too late, because if you fertilize when the flowers are just beginning to get pollinated, and you fertilize, then you can make them blast the fruit. So they drop. So then you have to wait until your fruits are probably the size of a large marble. And if you fertilize them before that, you can blast your fruit. So, but here's what you could do. Go buy milorganite, and you can get it at Home Depot for a song. You know, it's like a 30-pound bag for about $15. And it's a 640. So you have a nice bit of nitrogen, a little bit of phosphorus, so you'll get some fruiting. You don't have any potash, but you don't need much potash because it's residual. And if you did it once in a year, you're probably okay. But if you put that on now, what's nice is, now here, don't be off-put by this, but milorganite is made from sewage sludge. And so, but it's safe, and it's actually, if I recall, it's even OMRI certified. It's organic. But what they do, they heat it to 900 degrees. There are no pathogens that are going to hurt you. There are no longer, they used to talk about, well, there's heavy metals in it. Studies show there really aren't, and it's not a problem. I put it on my own trees, and I'm almost okay. But
John, really quick, what was that again? You mentioned the 640.
Yeah, it's called milorganite.
Milorganite?
Yeah, and it stands for Milwaukee Organics Company, and it was actually part of the city of Milwaukee. And it started out using the brewer's yeast that was left over from all the breweries, and they turned it into fertilizer. Well, then they said, well, how about the sewage sludge? We could use that too. And they cook it but it's a fabulous fertilizer. And what I like is you can't burn with it. If you put it on now, you could even over put it and you won't burn your tree, and it will very slowly uptake.
So John, really quick, my tree's probably about 5 feet. It's not very big. And is that something that I can get at some place like Walter Anderson, or do I have
sure.
to? Okay.
Sure. Yeah, they have it at Home Depot. They would have it at Walter Anderson's. They would have it at Dixie Line. Yeah, it's pretty readily available, but it's a very economical fertilizer for one thing. You know, you get a lot of fertilizer for your money, and it's very good.
Okay, can I ask one more question? I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Since I have your attention.
Sure.
So how often should I be watering? I mean, it's on a drip system, but I deep water it every once in a while, and I'm feeling like I'm not getting the watering right, and I think that's part of it.
Sure. Well, I often will tell people that all trees aren't created equal. So, you know, palms and stone fruits, they're pretty drought tolerant. They really don't need a lot of water. Avocados, it's like a tropical tree. It wants to be pretty wet all the time. It wants to dry out, but very moist. And citrus really are in that category too. They don't ever want to dry out.
Okay.
So yeah, and if you do cycles of wet to dry, wet to dry, wet to dry, I call them taco leaves, you know, where you get the leaves kind of curled up and they're tiny, and they look like little tacos. And if you have that going on, you're not watering enough.
Okay.
And so what kind of drip irrigation do you have?
It's just like, you know, a very small emitter, you know.
So it's an individual emitter?
Yeah.
Is it one of these that's on a spike and it kind of flows like this? Oh, I hate those.
Okay.
I hate those. And here's the reason, is that you go out one time and you adjust it and it will flow fine. But you come out a couple weeks later and it's like, it's almost clogged. And then another time you'll come out and that little cap is off of it and it's like a little, in what they call in Spanish, a chorro, you know, it's like a little geyser. And so you never know what's going on with your irrigation and your citrus. And so sometimes it gets enough, sometimes it doesn't get enough. It depends on how it's been adjusted. And I also find that people are they're less than generous with the number of emitters. So a landscaper puts in your tree and he's got like one next to the trunk of the tree.
Right.
Tree's going, hello.
So just really quick, you're thinking like deep watering once a week, or like
probably this time of year, I would say like once a week.
Okay.
But here's a thought, and I've taught, you know, I've been so busy I haven't had the chance to do as many free classes. I love to teach people. I mean, it just makes me tick. And so I used to do 3 or 4 free fruit pruning classes in the winter all the time, and I would usually do at least 1, maybe 2 free classes on how to do drip irrigation. You know, I do them at Grangetto's or other places, and I've just been so busy with the garden. It's like 5 full-time jobs, and then life has been crazy. But I do have on the agenda to actually do a drip irrigation class at the garden, and probably in January or maybe February. And so it would basically take a system that's existing. So, you know, everybody has some kind of irrigation system, but oftentimes it's inadequate. So, but you might have a riser, you know, or you've got a valve that works. So as long as you've got that there, we could convert that. And I could show you how to put in a pressure regulator, how to put in a filter, and then how to do, here's a way to go. And Nan and I are both always expressing this. You need to go with inline drip. And it's really pretty easy to do. And so I'm sure that in either January or February, we'll be doing a class, and probably at the garden, at the San Diego Botanic Garden, on how to do drip irrigation. And I would just encourage you to attend, because it's really pretty easy, and you could do it as a do-it-yourself project.
John?
Thank you so much. I'll mute now. Thank you.
That's great. No, that's fabulous. We can go on forever, but I'm going to ask kind of a final questions here, and a lot of the questions are, what's the schedule to use for the milorganite feedings? Is it once a quarter? And it kind of run through the scheduling of milorganite feeding of a citrus trees.
Okay. Yeah. So what I like to have, so here's a couple things. And when we do another citrus lecture, citrus class, a citrus history class, one of my heroes in citrus growing was Charles Chapman. And this really wonderful man. He wasn't a scientist, he was a publisher, but he loved raising oranges. And so what he did was he would record all of his experiments about what worked and what didn't work. Well, he found that for him anyway, it wasn't so important the fertilization, but mulching. So if he really became very adept at making sure all of his trees were well mulched. And so when I say mulched, I don't mean, half an inch of a little bark on the ground. We're talking 4 inches to 6 inches of arborist wood chips or something similar. And if you keep the soil cool and you keep the roots retaining moisture, and you begin to have this symbiosis of the organic material with the soil and the organisms, you don't have to do a lot. If I could just tell people the one thing that would transform, if you could just do one thing to make your citrus better, to make everything in your garden better, I'd say mulch. And so if you just did that, you'd be ahead of the game. But what I do for my own trees is I will do a double dose about, let's say April or so. So once the fruit are maybe beyond marble size. So let's say I do maybe 2 cups per inch girth of the tree, and then spread around the drip line. And then I would do it again about June, and then again about maybe August, and then one final feeding maybe late October, and then stop. Because if you're throwing food on it in the wintertime, it's really not going to be used. But what I do want to have is, if I continue to mulch and I continue to fertilize, my tree is going to have plenty of food, so that when you get that big thrust of growth in January, it's going to have plenty to eat. And, citrus are very heavy feeders. People don't realize how much food they need. And so if your tree looks lethargic, it's yellow, it's not growing much, you're probably not watering enough. You should mulch more and then really feed it a lot. And one of the things I like about the milorganite also is that it has a fair amount of iron in it. And the iron will really help your trees out, green them up. And it is just an added bonus to using the milorganite.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What oranges or tangerines would grow well in Solana Beach and pots?
Ooh, pots are tough. Pots are tough because, well, let's put it this way. If you're in a pot, it should be the biggest pot you can afford. Most people undersize pots significantly. So I'm talking, if I had my way, I wouldn't put anything in less than like a half barrel. Because you'll just find there's not enough root growth for them. They also, it's important that the roots don't stay hot. And so people have these, dark heat absorbing pots on a patio in the full sun. And those poor little roots get hot and they're miserable.
I have terracotta.
Yeah, if it's terracotta, it's better. Plastic is not great if it's black. But one of the best would be a Kishu mandarin, because it's a miniature sized tree anyway. They're very diminutive. And that's one of the best fruits you'll ever taste. It's so delicious. Okay. It's Kishu, Kishu. Okay. And they're from the island of Kyushu in Japan. And in fact, I think I recognize you used to come into Cedros Gardens a lot.
Yes.
Yes, of course. Hi. Yes. I used to help Mia there. And yes. I got my first Kishu from Mia's nursery. And it's my favorite citrus. It's so crazily delicious. They're like little golf balls, but the peel falls off, and they only have a harvest time of about 6 weeks, but it's 6 weeks of pure bliss. Because they are so sweet, they're so intensely orange flavored, and my grandkids used to pop them in their mouths, the whole thing, and then you just watch their eyes roll back in their head. They would just go nuts for them.
So I have several places, but I have two huge pots out in front, and I'd like them to look good. Will these look good all year round?
They're very vertical. You know, they're
Okay,
they're
that's fine.
they're narrow and kind of tall, but they're a diminutive little tree. Another one that's really good, it's an attractive looking tree, would be a tango mandarin.
Okay.
Tango. Tango is great. It's a cross between a mandarin and a grapefruit, and it's got a lot of interesting things in its background. So a tango is very good. And you know, one of the best citrus for a pot is a Meyer lemon. And very few people realize that when the Meyer lemon was discovered, it was actually discovered. He's one of my favorite characters. This guy, Franz Meyer, was, you know, gosh, there have been books written about him. He's just fascinating. But he was one of these food explorers that worked for David Fairchild. And he found what was named after him, the Meyer lemon. And he found it in China, and they didn't even use the fruit. They grew it purely because they thought it was pretty. And it was used as a patio plant in pots. And so if you want one that'll grow well in a pot, a Meyer lemon is like one of the best choices you could ever have.
Okay.
I thought,
Thank you.
I thought I would mention that Vallecito Water District, I guess in Escondido or San Marcos, I'm not sure where, but they came up with their own fertilizer from the sewage plant also.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a wonderful thing. You know, we have to do something with it. So, and it is it is sterile, and so there's really no issues with it.
Wasn't that a fabulous presentation, even with the hiccups? We thank you for watching our YouTube channel, and because John is so interested and knowledgeable about the history of citrus and horticulture in San Diego and Southern California, we are going to do this again. So subscribe to our channel somewhere on your YouTube screen. There is a place for you to subscribe, and there's even a notification thing that you can get notified if you would like, so that you won't miss any more of this wonderful discussion with John Clements. I am going to we are as a group going to try to put in the description below tonight's YouTube presentation recording links to the things that are mentioned in this, to the San Diego Gardener Facebook group that he mentions, and to the millorganite.com, that product that he mentioned, and to our Facebook and Instagram. And so look for that in the description below the video. And we look forward to having you watch our other videos until we post another one next month. And speaking of that, we would like to invite you to join the San Diego Horticultural Society. You can do so on our website, and that is at sdhort.org, and there is a tab for joining and or renewing. That it has all the information that you need to join us as a member. Members get emailed a link to the newsletter, and the membership writes the newsletter, and it's pretty spectacular and worth its weight in gold in the information that you learn about every aspect of everything that grows in our area. We also have a Facebook page and a Facebook group and an Instagram, and we look forward to you joining us there as well. So until next time, be well and stay safe. Thank you.